All right, moving on in Unit 9, the Interwar years, the 20s and the 30s. We're going to take a look now at the 1928 election and the outcomes there. So, Republican Calvin Coolidge could have technically run for office again. However, as early as like a year ahead of time in 1927, he was already telling press members that he really had no interest in running, and he let people in the party know, I'm not running again. And as we get to the actual primary for the two parties, Republicans and Democrats, the Republicans that have held on to office for the prior two elections, the 1920s, they're taking a look at the field and they're not too happy with any of the three who were running. Herbert Hoover ends up winning the nomination for the Republican Party and is basically a shoo-in because of how great, or at least how perceived great, the country was doing at that time. You know, perception is a pretty powerful thing. On the Democrat side, we have Al Smith, the governor of New York at the time, who was a very brave soul for running, as it turns out. So, in the end of things, in the 1920 election, we have about 58+% of the popular vote going for Hoover himself, so Republicans win quite handedly. This is a pretty big landslide victory for Hoover because we're talking 444 electoral votes go for him. That's almost all of them. I mean, there's only like 520 or so at the time, so that's quite a bit. We have 40% of the popular vote maintaining its loyalty to the Democrat Party at the time with Al Smith. So he wins the popular vote, and he most certainly wins the Electoral College, like say 444 to 87. It's not even remotely close. Historians believe that Al Smith made a pretty big mistake in the actual campaign circuit, because it turns out the two, Hoover and Smith, they shared a lot of similar ideas and beliefs on economic policies. So people who were, in the middle of the field, who could vote for either party, weren't really loyal to one or the other. They were taking a look at things of importance for them on a more social, personal level. So we're talking religious beliefs, the question over prohibition versus getting rid of it, and the actual just likeliness, or what do we have for a word there? I guess how much you like a candidate, for lack of a better term, their personality had a lot to play with it. So Smith was at a disadvantage in all of these areas. He is the first major party candidate to run for office as a Catholic. And of interesting note, he had already run for president a few times before this. So, I mean, he's very brave for doing that, because there was still a fear lingering in the country that if we have a Catholic president, would they be more predominantly loyal to the American people, or would the president take a law coming from the Pope to kind of supersede the American will of the vote? So Catholics were kind of like a no-no for actually pursuing high office at this time. Whereas Herbert Hoover was a bit of a Quaker, very, very open about it. You can call it a Protestant religion at the time. So it's basically Protestant versus Catholic. And of course, anything on the 1920s and nativism, people preferred Protestants, especially for public office at this time. Now, Prohibition was another popular issue. It had been going on at this point for almost 8 years. And Al Smith was very open as governor of New York, saying that he was in favor of ending Prohibition. He's what they would call a wet candidate. Now, the problem is that Prohibition was actually well-liked. Believe it or not, in 1928, the majority of voters who would be polled for things, they were okay at this point with Prohibition. And if you didn't live in one of the major cities, you didn't really become all that aware of the organized crime that was popping up because of Prohibition either. So kind of a reasonable level of naivete at the time was okay. If you're ignorant about an issue, it's hard to care about it, right? So most people in the country didn't like the idea that the Governor Al Smith running for the Democrat ticket was a wet candidate. And then we also take a look at their background. Now, Herbert Hoover was a Secretary of Commerce, a self-made millionaire himself in all respects. And at the end of World War I, he became very popular, almost like an American folk hero of his own type, in that he oversaw the rebuilding of Europe after World War I. And so he had a lot of success and a lot of items on his resume, essentially, to be president. Just his personality wasn't always well liked. Like I say, he's still a businessman at the end of the day, so sometimes it's hard to like a lot of people like that. Now, in this case, Al Smith also had an interesting way around into money, but Smith had a background of being a little more arrogant and stuck up and hard to really like. Having been raised in an urban setting, Smith was also talking on the radio at the time with a very thick accent that most people didn't really like. Kind of weird to think about, but when you're not really watching them on TV, you listen to how they sound, and whether you know it or not, you interpret people and you judge people based on how they talk. That's human nature. It's what we do. Whereas Hoover didn't grow up in a city. He grew up in Iowa and a rural farm. So, his accent was a little more approachable, listenable, if that's a word, for the public at the time. And the Democrats realized that all these issues kind of compounded into a mistake. But at the same time, you look at how good the economy was perceived to be doing in 1928, the Republicans were probably going to win no matter who they put forward, unless it was a complete idiot. So in this case, Herbert Hoover gets a landslide victory. Most historians actually take a look at this, and they kind of agree with that idea that the perception by especially the working middle and upper classes, especially in urban settings at this time, they really felt like the country was on the up and up. Herbert Hoover actually says in one of his speeches that America as a country is like right there on the cusp of ending poverty and being the first country to be able to say that. Now, of course, that's kind of mocked later on in history because obviously the Great Depression happens under his presidency. But as far as economic issues and policies and how great the economy is graded, if you look at the majority of presidents from the modern time, I argue from basically the Gilded Age on forward, economic weaknesses and strengths of, let's say, like the first year and a half of a presidential administration are really the effects of what the prior administration had done or had not done. The only exception to that rule are a few here and there who make very sweeping changes in their first few months in office to actually have a measurable impact in the economic circumstances of the country. So like say when FDR comes into office in 33, he's very quick and he actually starts that whole judging a president by what they do in the first 100 days, seeing what they actually are able to get through Congress and their agenda setting forth, because there's kind of like this honeymoon period of a presidency in that first 3 or so months. There's a couple exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, the first year and a half, I would argue, of a presidential administration, the economic outcomes that you see in those 18 or so months are really based on what the previous administration had done or, again, had not done. So the economic prosperity of the 1920s really sets up Hoover to be kind of a shoo-in candidate, and that's what ends up happening with the 1928 election. We have our third Republican elected to office, and as you know, during his first year administrating the country in 1929, we go through one of the worst moments in American history.